There comes a point in a troubled marriage when you stop asking, can I get through this? And start thinking, I don't want to feel this way 5 or 10 years from now. I know that moment because I lived it. But before you decide your marriage is over or convince yourself that you have to stay, you need to understand whether you're dealing with distance, damage, or deadlock, because they're not the same problem and they should not lead to the same decision. Maybe you've imagined leaving and then felt guilty for even thinking about it, or you're equally afraid that staying will cost you another 5 or 10 years. People may be telling you that marriage takes work. Others may be telling you that life is too short to be unhappy. And somewhere between those two options, you're trying to determine what's actually true about your marriage. Sometimes the pressure to make a decision becomes almost as painful as the problem itself. I'm Dr. Linda, and I help women over 50 make intentional decisions about what comes next. And this is one of the hardest. So before we look at what research says about gray divorce, I want you to know that I'm not talking about divorce only as an educator or a researcher. I've lived through it. My divorce was not a gray divorce. I was 28 years old when my first marriage ended. And initially, the divorce wasn't my choice. There had been infidelity while we were dating, and it happened again after we were married. I stayed because I wanted the marriage to work. I believed marriage was a commitment, and I wanted to know that I had done everything I could before I walked away. So for 8 months, I tried to live with what had happened and determine whether the trust could be rebuilt. But then one day I woke up and my thinking changed. I remember thinking, I don't still want to feel this way 5 or 10 years from now. I deserve better than this. That didn't mean I suddenly stopped caring, because I cared. And it didn't make leaving painless. And it didn't mean the marriage had never mattered. It meant I was no longer looking only at what I could endure that day, but I began looking ahead at the life I'd be choosing if nothing changed, if it happened again. Eventually, I left and moved forward. My experience is not your answer. It's just one example of why divorce can't be reduced to try harder or leave now. So I'm not here to tell you that every marriage can be saved, and I'm not here to tell you that divorce is the answer, simply because your marriage is going through a difficult season. I want to help you slow the situation down long enough to understand what you're actually dealing with. Gray divorce grabs headlines, but all too often they leave out the context that matters the most. They can make it sound as though couples reach a certain age, grow apart, and inevitably divorce. And that's not what the research actually shows. Researchers at Bowling Green State University's National Center for Family and Marriage Research found that nearly 40% of people going through divorce in the United States are now age 50 or older. That number is significant, but here's the part many of the headlines leave out. The gray divorce rate doubled between 1990 and 2010. More recently, however, the overall rate is largely leveled off. Among adults ages 50 to 64, it's even declined slightly. The pattern has been different among adults 65 and older, where divorce has continued to increase. And I know the question that creates, if the rate levels off between 50 and 64, why would it rise after 65? Does something suddenly happen to a marriage when a couple reaches that age? And the answer is no. Age 65 is a research category. It's not a marital expiration date. One likely explanation is generational. Baby boomers once occupied much of the 50 to 64 category, and now many have aged into the 65 and older group. They came of age during a period when divorce increased dramatically, and many who were divorced later and remarried. And that matters because second and subsequent marriages tend to be less stable than first marriages. Researchers have pointed to that history of divorce and remarriage along with the longer life expectancy as possible contributors to the continuing increase among older adults. But the numbers do not prove a single cause. This does not mean that if your marriage survives through age 64, it suddenly becomes endangered when you turn 65. It means different generations entered later life with different marital histories. The continued increase after 65 deserves a conversation of its own, especially because that's when retirement, identity, and the structure of daily life often change. But we'll come back to that later in this series. But none of those numbers can tell you what to do about your marriage, and that's exactly why the headline is incomplete. Another common explanation is that people divorce after 50 because the children leave home or because retirement forces couples to spend too much time together. And those transitions can absolutely change the conditions of a marriage. When children leave, the routines and responsibilities that once organized family life disappear. When one or both people retire, they may spend much more time together while also trying to determine who they are without the careers and the roles that shaped them for decades. Health changes, caregiving responsibilities, and financial concerns can also add even more pressure, but pressure is not the same thing as cause. A longitudinal study using 14 years of health and retirement study data examined whether an empty nest retirement and health changes increased the likelihood of gray divorce. After other factors were considered, the onset of an empty nest in either spouse's retirement were not independently associated with a greater likelihood of divorce. Marital quality, marital duration, home ownership, and wealth were more closely connected to the risk. That doesn't mean retirement or an empty nest is irrelevant. Those changes might remove distractions. They may alter routines or expose problems that were easier to avoid when life was busier. A busy household can conceal distance, and children can provide a shared focus. Careers give two people enough separate structure that unresolved problems remain easier to ignore. Then the structure changes and the house becomes quieter, and both people are focused to see their relationship more clearly. The transition did not necessarily break the marriage. It may have revealed its condition, and that brings us to the distinction that matters most. Are you dealing with distance, damage, or a deadlock? Let's begin with distance. Distance usually happens gradually. You may still care about each other, and there may still be kindness, respect, and even affection. But somewhere along the way, the marriage became more functional than personal. Most of your conversations are about appointments, bills, children, grandchildren, errands, or what needs to be done around the house. And you're managing life together, but you're not sharing very much of yourselves. That can feel frightening, especially when you look across the room and you realize you're no longer sure what your spouse is thinking, hoping for, or struggling with. But distance does not necessarily mean the marriage is over. If honesty, respect, and goodwill remain, and both people are willing to participate, there may be a way back to one another. We'll talk specifically about that in the next video, because feeling like roommates is not the same as having no relationship left to rebuild. Damage is different. Damage occurs when trust, emotional safety, or the basic stability of the relationship has been seriously injured. It may come from infidelity, repeated dishonesty, addiction, contempt, financial deception, or another breach that changes the way one person experiences the marriage. This is where well-meaning advice can become harmful. A marriage with damaged trust does not simply need more date nights, better communication, or a weekend away. You can't repair a serious breach by treating it as a lack of attention. Repair requires truth. It requires accountability. It requires changed behavior that continues long enough to become believable. And it requires understanding that forgiveness and restored trust are not the same thing. You may choose to forgive someone and still recognize that you can't peacefully or safely remain in a relationship. That was part of what I eventually had to understand in my own marriage. I could care about my husband. I could wish things had been different, but I couldn't force myself to trust someone whose behavior had repeatedly shown me that the trust was not secure. Then there's deadlock. Deadlock is what happens when the same problem keeps returning, but nothing meaningfully changes. You have the conversation, someone apologizes, promises are made, things may improve briefly, but a few weeks or months later, you're back in the same place again. Sometimes deadlock exists because both people feel overwhelmed and don't know how to change the pattern. But sometimes one person is doing nearly all of the reflecting, adjusting, forgiving, and trying, while the other minimizes the problem or waits for the tension to pass. And that matters. A marriage can't be rebuilt with one person working twice as hard. You can change the way you communicate, you can establish boundaries, seek counseling together, gather information, and examine your own behavior honestly. But you can't create mutual effort by yourself. Distance may require reconnection. Damage requires repair. Deadlock features an honest look at whether change is actually happening, and a marriage may contain more than one of these at the same time. You may have grown distant because of years of damaged trust, or you may have reached deadlock because every attempt to address the distance ends in defensiveness or avoidance. This is not about finding the perfect label for your marriage. It is about slowing down long enough to stop using the same solution for every problem. The wrong diagnosis can push you toward the wrong decision. Date nights cannot repair repeated betrayal, and a quiet season does not prove that a marriage is dead. Once you begin seeing the difference, the next temptation is to decide immediately what it means. But unless your safety requires immediate action, don't make a permanent decision in the hottest moment of a crisis. That doesn't mean ignoring what happened, and it doesn't mean minimizing betrayal or tolerating mistreatment or extending chances indefinitely. It means recognizing that shock, fear, and danger can make everything feel urgent, even when the wiser next step is to create enough room to think clearly. Time is not the only healer, and honestly, sometimes time doesn't heal the relationship at all. But time can lower the emotional temperature enough for you to see what's actually happening more accurately. It can show you whether an apology becomes accountability. It can reveal whether promises become sustained behavior. It can give you room to talk with a qualified counselor, understand your finances, learn about your legal options, and establish boundaries while you determine what you're willing to accept. A pause is not the same as doing nothing. A useful pause produces information, but waiting is not automatically wisdom either. Time can't repair what the people involved refuse to address, and time should never be used as an excuse to remain in a situation involving abuse, threats, coercive control, or immediate danger. Safety takes priority. Pausing is not required in abuse or immediate danger. The purpose of pausing is not to delay reality. It's to make sure fear and urgency don't make the decision before you've looked honestly at your options. If this conversation is helping you put words around something you've been feeling, subscribe and stay with me through this series. 5 videos, one each Thursday. Together, we'll look separately at what really ends a marriage after decades, the quiet distance that turns partners into roommates, rebuilding a marriage after 50, and rebuilding yourself when a marriage ends. Those are different experiences, and they deserve more than one-size-fits-all advice. Those 8 months didn't restore my trust in the marriage, but they gave me enough distance from the initial hurt to see the situation clearly. I realized that wanting the marriage to work was not the same as having what we needed to repair it. I could probably have stayed longer, but I didn't want to build the next 5 or 10 years around distrust and anxiety. Time did not make leaving painless. It helped me make the decision from clarity instead of the first wave of hurt. Years later, I began calling it my practice marriage, not because the pain wasn't real, but because it taught me what I did and did not want the second time around. And that's what time can sometimes give you. Not the answer you hoped for, but a clearer understanding of the life you're choosing. Clarity does not always feel good. Sometimes it confirms that there's still something worth rebuilding, and sometimes it reveals that a situation is more serious than you wanted to admit. And sometimes it shows you that you've been waiting for evidence of change that's never actually appeared. If you follow my videos, you know that I give you a challenge every week. So before you make a permanent decision, finish this sentence privately. Before I make a permanent decision, I need clarity about... Maybe you need clarity about whether both people are genuinely willing to participate. Maybe you need to know whether trust is actually being rebuilt or whether you're simply being asked to stop talking about what happened. Or maybe you need to determine whether this is a difficult season or a pattern that's followed you for years. Don't use that sentence to postpone what you already know. Use it to identify the question that still needs an honest answer. Gray divorce is real, but a statistic can't tell you whether your marriage should end. A headline can't distinguish between distance, damage, and deadlock. And no one outside your marriage can make that decision without understanding what you've lived through. A troubled marriage is not automatically a doomed marriage, but hope does not require pretending that every marriage can or should continue. Hope may mean finding your way back to each other. It may also mean finally seeing clearly what hasn't changed and trusting that your life can still be meaningful if the marriage ends. Either way, you're not powerless. In the next video, we're going to talk about what it means when a long marriage still works on paper but no longer feels close. There may have been no betrayal, no single crisis that broke everything apart. You still care about each other, but years of work and family and responsibility may have left you functioning more like a team than a couple. We'll take a look at what research says about how that distance can develop and the small everyday moments that can strengthen or weaken connection, and how to begin an honest conversation about whether you both want something different. This chapter of life isn't about staying at any cost or leaving before you understand what can still change. It's about facing the truth, choosing with clarity, and building what comes next with hope. I'm Dr. Linda, and I'll see you in the next video.